welcome. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk to authors a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. So delighted to have Erin Kate Ryan here with me. I'm not going to go through her bio because you're here because you know who she is and you can read up on our website or elsewhere. I don't want to waste another second of time. So Erin Kate, would you kindly begin by reading a couple of pages to us from your book?
Absolutely will.
If you have a copy.
I have a copy, and I'm going to read from the prologue. And I'm going to preempt one of the questions by saying this was in fact the first part of the book that I wrote. It has been, as one might imagine, heavily revised, but I wrote this as part of a prior project that I did that surrounded Paula Jean Welden. Quantum Girl Theory, Bennington College, Bennington, Vermont, 1946. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka, left her dorm for a hike on the Long Trail, and vanished into the thin mountain air of the trailhead. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka, left her dorm for a hike on the Long Trail, and was kidnapped by a man with a long maroon car and a history of violence against women. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka and left her dorm to take a cab to the bus station, where she set off for Montreal and the impossible idea of being a brand new girl. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka and left her dorm to meet her unkind boyfriend, who carted her to Fall River, blew through her cash, then ditched her for a moment in a diner, where she leaned over the counter and whispered to the waitress, how had it come to this? On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka, left her dorm, and was quietly institutionalized by a mortified family who'd rather pretend she was dead than admit to her troubled mind. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka, left her dorm, and met her botany teacher. After a quarrel over their relationship, he bludgeoned her in a damp clearing deep in the early winter woods. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka and ran away to join the circus, where she turned handstands on the backs of galloping horses and learned to tame fire by swallowing it. Quantum Girl Theory. Once she is gone, a missing girl becomes everything that everyone thinks she might be. Our theories create her fate. She's a runaway. She's a maniac. She is bones shrouded in a red cloth beneath an evergreen tree. She is a double, triple, quadruple exposure of any lifetime anyone could dream. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka, left her dorm, and began to exist by disappearing. And on December 2nd, the sun rose high and light hit the spot where the missing girl ought to have been. The National Guard climbed mountains in search, as did her father, the Boy Scouts, a wily private eye. Clairvoyants dreamt of her, calling the newspapers to report their visions, ice picks, black cars, and all-consuming fire. The detective gathered facts. The eldest of four sisters, father a Scotsman, mother a drunk. She preferred to be called Paul, but the Bennington girls rarely called her anything at all. Quiet, studious, unremarkable. The hole she left, somehow bigger than the space she once filled. Quantum Girl Theory. A missing girl, by virtue of having endless possible lives, is more real than a non-missing girl who gets only one life at most. Newsmen flooded the rural Vermont town, wingtips sinking into mud. Spectators, readers of the mystery, postured as heroes. They stopped lovely blondes in New York and Charleston. They rounded up white girls in Miami and Spokane, holding up smudged newspaper snapshots, squinting with suspicion and spite, gripping the elbows of strangers on opposite coasts, competing to capture the hefty reward, to capture the true Paula Jean, to tell the story's true end. On December 1st, 1946, Paula Jean Welden put on a bright red parka and shattered into innumerable futures. One life could never be enough. Quantum girl theory. A missing girl's potential life stamps a new world into being. All her paths are possible. They are happening all at once and in symphony. Across the nation, newspapers recorded every sighting, writing into existence Paula Jean as a starlet, Paula Jean as a housewife, Paula Jean as a hollow-faced nurse, a misfit, a mistress, a victim, a crime. At a stained and round dining table, imagine infinite Paula Jeans, aged and cherub-faced, scarred and broken and barely touched. Each looks at the others, the sister, the self. Lives lived and half-lived, lives thrown away, redeemed, or lost. She is Legion. She reaches across the table and takes her own hand.
Thank you. I'm going to invite everybody while you're processing that to, I know it is amazing, isn't it? It just blows my mind. So you can start putting your questions in. It would be helpful for those of us with recent cataract surgery if you write the word question in all caps ahead of it. But if not, I will put on the big old glasses and figure it out. So where to begin? All right, I'm going to stick to my notes because I already want to like jump in and ask. Okay, so I'm going to stick to my notes. So let's start with, tell us who the heck you are.
I'm Erin Kate Ryan. I have, prior to this book, written lots of short fiction and was kind of shocked that I had a book in me. I graduated from Bennington College MFA program 8 or so years ago. I have a dusty law degree. I largely work for nonprofits, doing consulting work, writing and storytelling. And I teach writing with a couple of different organizations, including the Loft and Hudson Valley Writing Center, as well as I collaborate on a project called the Minneapolis Storytelling Workshop. I formerly lived in Minneapolis with another writer. We send out writing lessons and prompts that use television as our shared literary object, because we, both of us teaching, us often found that students were nervous that they had not read widely enough, but actually had very interesting, insightful opinions about television. And since, like so many things, television starts out on the page, we decided to treat it like that.
Oh, listen, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the power of the written word, absolutely. So I want to get a little bit of a sense of you and your writing journey. So all right, let's start with so you have a dusty law degree, samesies. So how did you decide to write? What was your path to becoming a writer?
I always knew that it was my happy place, but I think that I had a lot of concern about ever claiming writer as a
People do
vocation. I started taking some writing classes at the Literary Center in Boston, which is called Grub Street. Went while I was an attorney. I think of it often as to save my life, because I was very unhappy. I felt like I was becoming less interesting by the day, and I needed something to remind myself that I was a whole person. And it took me about, close to 10 years before I considered an MFA. In part because I had a whole lot of student debt from law school and wasn't sure if I was allowed to go back and get another graduate degree. And also because I grappled a lot with, I spent in many years in activism. Often that was 60 or 70 hours a week of my life, and grappled a little bit with whether I thought writing was too selfish of a pursuit. I've gotten over that for sure. I do think and have come to understand my writing as part of my activism, and also, of course, that making something in the world is fundamentally an activist, a political act in a world where we're taught to consume.
So just a little tangent. So speaking as a fellow activist, I found your story. Spoiler alert: I am a missing girl archetype book fan, and your book and some of the articles you've written really brought me up short and thought, wait a minute, what is it about you that is drawn to this? And I totally find your writing motivating in terms of understanding why people are so drawn to the missing girl archetype. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself. So tell us a little bit about your path to publication. So you were a lawyer, you were an activist, you're writing, I know you have some other pieces out along the same Paula Jean topic, but what was your path to publishing this book?
I started the book about 6 months after I finished my MFA program. And I was kind of surprised that this is what I was going to be doing, but Paula Jean was sitting in my studio saying, look, you've done the research, you got to do something with this. She really was kind of pushing me. So I started working on the book. I conceived of it always from the beginning as multiple different versions of the life that Paula Jean might have led. And I feel like my pathway to publication is kind of like the archetypal one. Like I also worked on publishing short fiction throughout that time. I went to a number of writing conferences. I went to Bread Loaf and Sewanee. I met a few agents there. I went to a lot of writing residencies, and some of the other artists that I met would tell me about their agents. And so when I felt like the book was as far as I could get it, which was in 2018, I queried agents. I thought it would be a very long process because that's kind of the common knowledge. I tailored my queries and I tailored my queries to each individual agent, because I know that often people who are listening take this as a how-to. So that is exactly
why we're here.
The agents who I had met, I referenced that. There were a few who I had not met, but I had read interviews with them. I knew what they were interested in. I knew what else they represented. I got requests for the full manuscript very quickly. Within 45 minutes from one agent, I had a request for the full manuscript. And I had kind of thought I would have a couple of months to fine tune it, because that's what they tell you. So you have a little bit of time, expect to hear something back in 4 to 8 weeks. And so I really thought I was going to be able to set it aside for a week or two and then come back and polish. And that did not happen to be the case. So I ended up sending it out to multiple agents and talking to a number of them on the telephone, and had selected an agent for representation within a week and a half or so, 2 weeks maybe, of when I sent out the initial query.
Okay, I'm just gonna put in a spoiler alert for everybody, because I attend a lot of craft chat. That is the miracle story. That's incredible.
I know. I'm a unicorn. I would say that what it was clear to me, because so much of my short fiction is real weird, is not like this at all. I like to write about characters that are a little bit human and a little bit not, and is far more fantastical. And it was clear that this topic was something that was hitting a vein. I was very fortunate to have a fair amount of grant support, artistic grants supporting the development of the manuscript up until this point. So I understood that I tripped over a topic that was really rich and was interesting to people.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I want to know why you landed on Paula Jean. You said she was sitting in your studio telling you to write about her. How did you even know who she was? So, excuse me, would you consider this incredible book historical fiction?
I mean, let me answer the second one first. I don't know. I did a hell of a lot of historical research for it, but I've never, and I know that a lot of the fiction that I'm interested in takes place in time periods that are not the one I'm living through, but I don't, historical fiction is such a term of art and like where things are placed at Barnes and Noble. So I really have no idea. It is a re-envisioning of a hypothetical history that might have happened. So I really, I don't know. I mean, it's a thought experiment as much as anything. But I found Paula Jean because I was really interested in the idea that a person could create fiction that does not live just on the page, but in fact interacts with the reader in very contemporary, real life ways. As I was researching the contours of this, and I was dipping into things like situationism, Flexus, as well as alternate reality gaming, a lot of which lives online, some of the research I was doing was showing, yes.
Can you go back and explain what you just meant? All those words that you said? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Sure. Yeah. So I had this idea, like, what if you're reading a story and then you get a text message from the main character, right? Like all of a sudden your fiction does not just live on the page anymore. What does that mean? And I really wanted to explore, like, how are the ways to make this happen? And there's some immersive theater that has done a little bit of this work. There are games, alternate reality games, that do a bit of this work, but it's rarely narrative. And I had this idea that narrative fiction that engages you, that requires or at least invites you to engage with the characters as yourself, but the idea that you could perhaps change what the characters do, you can have a completely different experience of this fiction than anyone else because you are yourself interacting with it. So I was doing kind of a wide survey of the different types of art that people had created that kind of came with this like transmedia idea. And one thing that I kept seeing pop up was that again and again, people who were creating, like, escape rooms were just starting around this time, but escape rooms or alternative reality games, that the one thing that captures the most attention is a missing girl. Like that is the one element to all of these stories that seem to encourage more people to participate. And so I started thinking a little bit about that. That was what really made me start thinking about the function of missing girls in our literature, in our social stories, our cultural stories, and ran across completely by happenstance a Shirley Jackson short story called Missing Girl, and went to do a little bit of research on the inspiration for the story and found that she had written it about Paula Jean Welden. It was a fictionalized account, highly stylized and very tongue-in-cheek account of Paula Jean Welden's disappearance. Shirley Jackson lived in North Bennington. Her husband taught at Bennington. She would have been extremely aware of the case. But that was the first time I had seen that name. And so then I started doing the research on Paula Jean Welden. It felt like a fascinating overlap that I was studying at Bennington. And so I ended up using Paula Jean Welden's case and many of the facts around her case, drumming up people's interest in that in order to stage one of these fictions, an experiential fiction. And after I'd done that, then I just had all of this material on Paula Jean Welden. And I had made such a point of the fact that when girls go missing in stories, it means that the story never follows them. They never get to actually be the protagonist because the story stays with the people who are searching and who are sad and who have to rebuild their lives. And yet I had not yet remedied that for Paula Jean. I still had just kind of told this meta story about her disappearance, but that in no way created or envisioned a story that followed her. And so that was what pushed me to formulate the structure, the initial structure for this book, which was that this would be multiple versions of a life she might have lived after she left. The story follows her just the way it follows boys who go on adventures. It would follow the girl who left, rather than staying with the sad parents, the cops who are looking, the society that has to repair itself.
So amazing. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I do see questions coming in. I appreciate your putting the question, Colin. I'm going to ask one more of my questions out of my many pages, and then I'll jump to yours. Speaking of the missing girl archetype, and I'm assuming everybody knows what, so I'm going to ask you to just give a quick description of what the missing girl archetype is, because I don't want to assume everybody here knows what that is. But I will also, before I also wanted to speak to something you wrote for Lit Hub. So you wrote, because men may leave, but women disappear. Boys have adventures, but girls go missing. And in their missingness, the story is built, a story of binary opposition. So that's what you're talking about here, which just about following. Well, I'd like it, actually, I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'd like to hear what you think. So the missing girl archetype, and then to talk more about how you did what you did, following her story, and in so many, Schrodinger's cat, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the missing girl archetype, so it was Gwen Ifill who first kind of coined the term missing white woman syndrome, but I think that idea was floating around certainly in the ether, that so often the stories that gain the most attention in the United States, and this is also true in the UK, and it is true in Australia, and it's true in Canada, are white women, usually of what we call reproductive age, and that's a shifting target, but somewhere between like 13 and 38 maybe now. There was a woman who went missing when Paula Jean was missing, who was 40, and they kept calling her an elderly woman. But so it's a woman or a girl who is like at an age that is considered ripe for being vulnerable, right? Vulnerable to the worst things we can imagine. She's going to be straight. She is going to be conventionally attractive for whatever that means in that moment. She is going to be normatively abled. She will probably not be physically disabled. She will appear to be what we call sane. She will be cis. She will not be a trans girl or a trans woman. She will be desirable in the ways that society defines desirability. And that desirability is coupled with her vulnerability, right? Like, it matters that she's white because the very first missing white women stories were captivity narratives in this country of white pioneer women who were kidnapped, who were swept away by tribal members, Native American tribal members. It requires this encroaching idea of danger and the way we have shaped danger in this country and in these societies. And so she represents something that we hold, that people say they hold precious, but also that's it. That's all we know about her. We don't usually know if she's a firebrand or if she gets in trouble a lot, or she has to be wealthy enough or socioeconomically placed that we don't consider her already to be lost in a kind of capitalist sense. Her religion matters. She needs to be blandly religious. So for a long time, Catholic girls were not considered to be of interest when they would go missing. Right? It requires this sense of she needs to be the perfect white projection screen for all of our vague concerns about what is wrong with the world. And then we just project them. And her innocence, her presumed innocence, the loss of that then becomes everything that is wrong with the world. And it's what's interesting to me is that so often when these stories were written by men, I mean, what was left was a family that would fall apart, and then the heartbroken sister and but as more and more of these stories, because they continue to proliferate, are written by women, often when the woman or the girl goes missing, what it actually does is show that there was no domestic bliss to begin with. When men were writing the story, it was like, oh no, and it ripped the family apart. Whereas when the women are writing, they're like, the family was fucked to begin with. Like, this was all pretend anyway. And now we're just looking at the seamy underbelly. But there is still, she still serves as this disruptive object in her absence, which means that she's never going to be the hero. She's never going to be the one who has the idea or has the key, or she can never be an agent in her own story, because the story's over. It actually doesn't matter if she's dead or alive. The minute she goes missing, the story's closed on her.
That is so interesting, because for me, I listened to a lot of female written audiobooks during the pandemic. As I was walking my dogs, I was drawn to missing girl stories, and now I will think more about it. Okay, so I'm going to turn about what was there for me. But you're right, it is the woman goes missing, and she's no longer a part of her own story. Okay, I'm going to go to the questions. Okay, is an MFA necessary? Oh, here come the glasses, sorry. Of one of many different avenues, what advantages do you feel it gave you?
I mean, I think that there's an artificial production schedule attached to an MFA that can be really helpful. You can't, I went to a low residency program. So that meant that I only saw people twice a year for 10 days. Everything else was conducted. I mean, long enough ago that it was still, we were printing and mailing. And if you're writing 40 pages of fiction every 3 weeks, in your real life, you're probably not going to be able to churn out that much. So it can get you accustomed to creating material, becoming less precious, to just generate drafts, which it can, for many writers, be the hardest part. I think that it gives you the opportunity to build a community of writers who are situated similarly to you, and 100% making friends and taking care of them is absolutely the most important thing you can do in life, in activism, and in art. It gives you an opportunity to work with writers whose work you may know, whose work you may respect. Not every good writer is a good teacher. So that's all I can say. Not every writer is a good teacher. And it gives you the chance to take yourself seriously. I think that, if you're a bartender and you're like, but really I'm a writer, everyone's going to roll their eyes at you. But if you're a bartender and also you're an MFA program, right, there's this participation in an institution that can give you a sense of feeling validated. Some of the stuff on that list is illusory and you don't actually need it. But those are the things that an MFA program can offer. And first, for a full residency MFA program that can offer teaching experience, you don't need it. Of course not. Nobody needs any of this stuff. MFA programs offer a lot. They employ working writers, which I actually think is an essential, this is also why places like the Writer Center and Grub Street and employing working artists is a very good reason to exist, as far as I'm concerned. But they aren't necessary. I don't know. You can take yourself more seriously, but you don't have to have it. And there are a number of writers who I'm certain that you respect who do not have MFAs. And an MFA is ultimately reading a lot of books, trying to write one, and learning from your peers. And you can do all of that outside of that institutional setting.
Well said. Are any speculative sci-fi fantasy writers inspirational to you? Did any of those folks' work guide you in writing Quantum Girl Theory? And I just want to I'll just ask you to talk about the title because because after the prologue, it goes away.
It does.
Mostly. So
I have to say, I hate the question of who have you read and who do you, and because the minute someone asks the question, every writer I've ever heard it disappears from my head. The same way where if the doctor's like, have you ever broken a bone? I'm like, I literally cannot remember. But I will say that the title came to me after I was reading Ruth Ozecki's book, A Tale for a Time Being, which is a phenomenal novel. I absolutely love it. And I would place her, I don't know that she would call herself speculative, but what she is like, she plays with narrative and she plays with form. She plays with the concept of time, and she's doing it very much from like a Zen Buddhist perspective, but in a way that is, I found very exciting and made my brain thingy zap. And so quantum theory or quantum mechanics it's a set of theories that have to do with the idea of there's like an unknown, they call it a quant, an unknown object item. They're talking about very small, and trying to describe the principles of something once you don't know it. So Schrodinger's cat, which Amy mentioned, is one of the many kind of concepts that are tangled in with quantum theory, entanglement, quantum entanglement, the Bell's theory. So all of these ideas, the stuff that when someone says, you know, a butterfly flaps its wings in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you get a D on your test, like that is quantum theory. And so where I tapped into it was this idea that, and some of I kind of redefined it as quantum girl theory, but if the girl, when she's missing, she becomes our unknown particle, then quantum theory says, one of the principles says, every hypothesis you create is equally true because we don't know. So that's kind of Schrodinger's cat, right? The cat is both alive and dead because you don't know. So for a little while, it's both. There is no binary. It is both alive and dead. The idea that the multiple universes theory, which is that every hypothesis actually creates a universe in which that is true, I drew from as well. So that's kind of where it came from. But quantum theory was developed after most of the chapters of the book take place, which is one of the reasons it could not be incorporated into the actual chapters, because this was something that was developed through the late 40s, through the 70s. It was something that Einstein didn't even agree with, like, you know, so I couldn't kind of rough it into the narrative, which is why the prologue is pretty explicit about this is what I mean.
Is that part of your law school education? Just a little side hustle? Okay.
Yeah, probably.
So another question about the education part of the process. So how do you feel workshops like Bread Loaf or Sewanee helped you? Oh, I almost had it. Or possibly hindered you with your writing, with your networking, with your relationship with other writers. And I actually think we can all guess on or based on your earlier answer about the helping, but I'm interested in the hindering part of the question.
I mean, I think that walking into any workshop where you're meeting people fresh, they have no idea who you are as a writer, and then handing them work out of context and depending on your level of confidence with that work, can absolutely be a damaging experience. And I think that more and more, driven particularly by writers of color who are talking about the way that the MFA workshop is not supportive of experiences and narratives that are outside what has been the dominant paradigm for so long, we're understanding that is not in its like pure Iowa form. It's not always helpful. And I think that I have seen writers experience that. I would say I have had workshops at various places where I've brought in stories where my main character is human, but he has a balloon for a head, and I just want you to accept it, and people won't accept it. And no one has any reason to think you know what you're doing, right? You're just handing them something. They don't know if it's a first draft or a 10th. So I would say that in general, those kind of one-off workshops can be really stressful for that reason. they can introduce you to brand new perspectives on your own work, or just brand new experiences of your readers. Like I had another story, and there was a high school physics teacher who happened to be one of the other workshop participants. And I had totally not even looked at, misunderstood like a kind of fundamental concept of physics. And it was actually really useful to have someone say, you need to look up vacuum and the way it works again. Because my regular circle of writers would, I said something with enough confidence, they didn't question it, but I actually needed someone who was gonna like not buy my bullshit. I think that those, Bread Loaf has fundamentally changed since I went. I went as a waiter in 2015. They have since dismantled the waiter program.
I'm sorry, what is that, the waiter?
Waiters you go as on scholarship as a waiter.
An actual, like, here's your food?
Yep. And it is actually an incredibly servile position. Like you're up at 5 a.m. in order to serve breakfast to all of the other writers who paid to be there. So you are both on scholarship because you're a talented writer, but also you're doing a lot of heavy labor. And so you miss a fair amount of the conference as a result. And because Bread Loaf was, on the one hand, making efforts to be more inclusive on who they were inviting as waiters. But on the other hand, because that position was still menial, it was creating then a much more clearly racially tiered system. And they cut it out a couple of years ago. They were like, this is not working. But I would say that there is, all of these kind of, their bread and butter is their history, the fact that they have had famous writers, that they attract famous writers. It can create an apprentice kind of system that either you jive with or you don't. So I think that there are some people who go and get a lot out of it. And then there are others who are like, this is just not my vibe, and who don't. And that's the type of thing you really only know going or having intimate conversations with people who have been.
And I would imagine that depending on who's there each year, that things shift anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that waiter program does not sound.
It's one of those things where, like, name an MFA instructor in the last 25 years and they were a waiter. Like Amy Hempel was a waiter. Like there are names, these big names that it was meant to be like wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing. We're putting our talented kids to work. But over time, it really just, I think, revealed itself to be residual of a rather archaic way of looking at talent and the passing of that talent.
And back to your work. But no, this is really interesting to talk about, the whole universe of writers and how we do what we do and what helps and what hinders. So there was a question about your revision process. Was it harder or easier given that the story is such a different format? And I would like to actually ask you to talk a little bit about the format and then the revision part, because you have newspaper clippings at the beginning of certain sections. So can you just, for people who haven't read your book, and you should go buy it at an independent bookseller. I don't get commission. But just can you explain the format and the multiple narratives you have going, and then talk about the revision a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So the prologue kind of is the map for the book. So as I was reading each of the potential lives what fates that Paula Jean met after she put on her red parka, many of them then match back to that. So each of the chapters, each of the lives kind of spooled from some of these newspaper articles that I found. There were literally tens of thousands written contemporary to her disappearance. Like she was.
Excuse me. So are all the ones that you put in the book are factual?
Well, were the newspaper articles factual is the question. And that was what I was interested in, because eventually they were spelling her name wrong. They were getting the details of her physical appearance wrong. They were saying she was from somewhere she wasn't. They kept calling her a co-ed, but Bennington was only a women's college. Like they were getting the number of her sisters wrong. And then they were really just kind of publishing anything anybody had heard, because it was selling papers. Like this was This was the Natalie Holloway. This was the Gabby Petito of 1946. Like, this is one of the earliest big missing white women cases in the United States. So I looked at some of them and thought, well, already based on what I know to be facts, they're all a little bit right and a little bit wrong. So what if I take many of these stories and make them a little bit right and a little bit wrong? So there was an article that said that a cab driver had dropped her off so she's getting on the bus to Raleigh. And so I started looking just in that area, and that's how I ended up with a chapter, kind of a version of her life where she's in Elizabethtown, North Carolina. One where a woman was stopped with the name Mary Garrett because she looked just like, or they thought she looked just like Paula Weldon. So that's where that character's name comes from. So the names all come from women who were stopped by the cops and asked if they were Paula Weldon. And then many of the details were drawn from those newspaper stories, because I was fascinated by the multiple alternate versions of her life that were being created in newspapers, which purport to be factual. And if you were to believe them all, then there were 350 Paula Jeans running around the country doing all sorts of things. So that's what pushed me to kind of approach this already with a multiplicity of lives in my mind. And so there are 7 versions of Paula Jean. One of them becomes kind of the core through line of the story, the touchstone. They take place at all different times in history, all different times of her life, but all of them after she left Bennington. Some of them, she is a victim. Some of them, she is an asshole. I wanted to extend her the grace of getting to change or refuse to change, to be human, to be prickly, to be loving, to be a betrayer, to make good. So more or less, there will be a version of her life, and then we return to the kind of the through idea, the through line, the Mary Garrett in North Carolina. So each time a new version of Paula Jean's potential life is presented, newspaper articles, the historical newspaper articles are reprinted, which kind of give the reader the opportunity to dig into what was written at the time. And what I'm hoping, because I love puzzles, to have like the little thrill of then seeing some of those details filter in. There are no articles as we continue Mary Garrett's life, because we had already kind of, the initial one set it off. And because Mary Garrett's story becomes about 2 Black girls who have gone missing and whose disappearances are not being covered really by the newspapers. They don't seem to be of interest to the cops. And because there are simply not as many historical newspapers about missing Black girls in the United States. When you look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia weirdly has a page on missing girls, an aggregate page. And I went through and read every single one of them. And I tell you, 97% of them are missing white girls. And we just know that that is not statistically representative of what's happening. So that was another reason that there are a few chapters that don't have the news articles. There was a second part to your question, but I feel
so it was going to be about revision, but
right.
But before you talk about revision, or as part of it, I'd like to know how you. I mean, you're clearly not a pantser, right? You're not going by the seat of your pants. I mean, this seems like it seems like it was meant. How did you plan this out, and then how did you revise? Because there are a lot of threads going. You can see what I'm doing with my hands, right?
Yeah. For a long time, I held it all in my head, honestly, and I did pants a lot of it. I'm not an outliner. So I started with, I would just start writing a chapter, a version of Paula Jean. I would start, and I had a number of ideas that then never came to fruition. I really wanted her to be a cult leader, but I couldn't figure out how to make it work. So I would start a chapter, and I knew that I was working from the newspaper articles, and I wanted each one of them to somehow kind of glance against this category of missing woman, so that to kind of show how shifting and illusory those categories are. So she's old, she's insane, she's queer, like taking these categories, any of these defining characteristics that would have no longer made anyone interested in her. So I did over time revise in order to make sure that the stories came together as a novel. I did not want anyone reading it as a collection of short stories because they're all happening at once. They are all equally true. They are all, and so they also inform each other. And I think that was where the revision came the most, was ensuring that they were really informing each other, that they felt connected, that they felt like they were they were accumulating toward the end together.
I want to throw in a Writer Center question, standard Writer Center question that is, what was there anything about what you wrote that no one has asked you about? Something you did that no one noticed or said that they noticed?
Yes, or no one has said that they've noticed.
I noticed, whatever it is, I noticed.
You did it? Okay. So things that, like, there are tons of references to the historical record that are obliquely there, which just made me happy, because I have such, like, the newspaper articles are in my DNA at this point. But there are only a few girl stories where the story follows them, where the girl leaves and the follow. One of them is Alice in Wonderland. One of them is Wizard of Oz. But what happens at the end of both of them? They wake up. We got to go with them on the adventure, but they didn't really have adventures. And it's such a bummer. And the very idea of her putting on the red coat and going into the woods has such a Little Red Riding Hood feel about it. So there are a number of references to wolves and paths and slipping the path. And there is a chapter where I basically worked really hard to recreate the Mad Hatter's tea party, up to and including the disappearing cat, because it thrilled me to incorporate this idea and because it is a chapter where she is having an experience that no one external to her would recognize. And that felt very appropriate to me. Alice goes home, nobody is going to believe her about the Queen of Hearts.
That is super interesting. All right, pull out the glasses. What are the legal issues with using a real person as a main character and then making things up about their lives? And how many lives did you start but not complete? So you said you ended up with 7 in the book. So two very different questions there.
Different questions. Legal issues. I mean, she died. So there is actually your reputation dies when you die, I guess I would say, like, legally speaking. And she also died. I mean, we don't know when. She could be alive, right? Like, she literally could be alive. She would be Betty White's age.
She's not alive.
Who's not any longer alive, but like, she could still be kicking around, like, right? Like, there are 96-year-olds. But presumably she is no longer on this earth. Maybe she's in space. But so she's not in a position to take any legal action. I mean, I'm saying this as a writer, not a lawyer. I did not study like defamation and liability law, but I do want to slightly digress and say there are, however, ethical issues with it. And I took those very seriously. And it actually took me a long time before I wrote into the first 18 years of her life. I was really only playing with everything that happened after she put her hand on the doorknob, because then the universe was open. And I was very shy about dipping back into those first 18 years for a long time, because whatever I wrote would be writing over a truth. And that felt very complicated. And it took somewhere between a pep talk and a scolding from my agent before she's like, but you're writing fiction. The whole point of writing fiction is to use your imagination, to really lean into. But I had my own process for feeling okay about what I was doing. The second question was the other lives.
Right, the almost round, the darling.
Yes. There were 2 that combined into one in the final version of the book. And every so often I will still, when I'm going through papers, find like the first 2 paragraphs of one that I had started and then abandoned early. But in one of them, she was living abroad. She was living in Belgium. And I liked the idea of getting her out of the United States. But ultimately, I was still in that chapter working through terrain that I had already worked through in a prior chapter. And so it was not doing anything for the book as a whole.
Have you heard from any of her relatives?
I have not. I'm definitely not the first person who has written about her, and I'm not even the most, like, this decade.
You're the coolest.
So
you're the coolest.
Well, thanks. So like, there was this mystery writer, Hilary Waugh, who he invented the police procedural novel. This is kind of commonly acknowledged. So before him, there were not books that were told from the perspective of the detectives, dun dun, right? So Hilary Waugh essentially invented Law and Order and all of the millions of seasons of it. His first book was about Paula Jean Welden. It's called Last Seen Wearing. And it was about her disappearance, but it was about the cop who was trying to solve the mystery. And it was a fictionalized account. There was a book just less than 10 years ago called Shirley, which is a novel about Shirley Jackson from the perspective of a fictional young woman who rents a room from Shirley Jackson and her husband. And in that novel, the writer implies that Shirley Jackson murdered Paula Jean Welden for having an affair with Stanley Edgar Hyman, her husband, who was teaching. And like, Stanley Edgar Hyman did marry a Bennington College student shortly after Shirley Jackson died, and commonly acknowledged that he was sleeping around with his students. But people have been writing about her, and she's been part of our fiction for 75 years. As far as I know, only one of her sisters is still living. And I did not contact her because I did not see a reason to bother her. Honestly, like, this is something she's lived with for 75 years. So I could only hope that, my real hope is just that Paula Jean is around and she reads the book and she hates it and she sends me a little bit of hate mail, because her real life is so much more interesting than anything.
We are just about out of time. I have so many other questions about your research. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to wrap up with the question of what is the one piece of advice that you would give to a writer just starting out?
Well, I already gave my general advice, which is make friends and take care of them. But I think that very much stands. You just have to write a lot of crap first. Like, what I would say is just write and write and write and write and write, and don't show it to anybody for a little while. Like, just write everything that you can write. Rewrite a story that you've already read, rewrite a television program you've already seen. Just write and get all of the junk out of you first. Get all of the stuff where you're just retelling the stories you've been hearing for your whole life. Get all of that out of you. And eventually you're going to find the story that only you can tell, the one that hasn't been told a million times. And you're going to know when you've landed on that story. I just feel like you just know it in your stomach. No one else could write the story the way I'm writing it. I've never read it before. I'm writing the story I want to read. And that's when you can start sharing it with people who love you and support you and who can help you get to the next draft to make it bigger and bolder. But don't listen to anybody who's going to charge you to help you turn your very first draft into a book or something. Like, do it for the love of doing it, and do it because you know that you can get to that story that only you can tell. And that's when you're changing the world, because you're putting something in it that's never been in it before.
And that's a wrap. This has been super interesting. Thank you so much. I think I just put all the links. I meant to put the bookshop link. It's the last one. Buy the book, read the book, write reviews. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you for your time and your attention. It's the most important thing you can give, really. So